in our series on the great questions of life. We've talked about the origin of life. We've talked about the meaning of life. And last week we talked about our destiny, where we're headed. And today we're going to talk about authority. And nobody likes authority in the United States anymore. Authority is a bad word. So bear with me as we talk about authority today. To understand the world that we live in, we have to understand or answer some questions, some very fundamental questions of life. This is what we do. As human beings, we try to wrestle with the questions of life. It's one of the things that makes us different from the lower animals. I mean, your dog doesn't go around wondering, where did I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? And your cats don't wonder if all dogs go to heaven. Come on, I work on some of these things a little bit, those aren't questions that they ask. What animals really want to know is, where's my next meal coming from and when am I going to take a nap? I want to start off by giving you 3 reasons why these big questions that we're dealing with are important, why they matter. Some people may think that we're wasting our time and we need to start dealing with religious things. I want to suggest to you that they are extremely important and, if you will, very religious. The first reason is they shape how we live. These big questions, your answers, shape how we live. We may not think that these questions are very important or they have any impact on our life, but what we value, what we treasure, shape our lives. Ideas have consequences. Ideas have consequences. Think about that. And the bigger the idea, the bigger the consequences. And there's no bigger idea than the question about the meaning of life. What in the world is the purpose for us being here? Questions about right and wrong. Questions about authority. There are no bigger questions than the one we've been dealing with last week about God and heaven and hell. These are the big questions that we have. Ideas have consequences. And they have consequences in 2 levels. One, I didn't give you a lot to write down today. What we believe about these things impacts how we live as individuals. It's going to determine how you believe about things will determine how you vote in November. How you believe and how you think about things will determine if you vote in November. You may not live like you profess, but you will live what you really believe. You may not live what you say. Well, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that or I think this is really important. You can say all you want to, but you live by what you really believe is important. Ideas have feet. They walk out of your brain and into your life, and they determine how we live and how we make decisions. They determine how we relate to one another, what we buy, what we don't buy, and all kinds of different things. Not only do they have these big questions impact how we live as individuals, it impacts how we live together in a culture. Number 2 was culture. They impact how we live as cultures. By culture, I want to give you a definition. The working out of our deepest beliefs. Cultures are the working out of our different beliefs together. As you work out what you believe is really important, I work out in my life what's really important, together we make the culture here of St. John's. We are facing a lot of big questions and moral dilemmas in our culture right now, in our world right now. Dilemmas about the definition of what it means to be one of us. The abortion. Is the fetus a part of a human race? I mean, when do we become human? What makes us human? What gives humans value? What gives a human purpose for living, as we talked about the end-of-life issues that we have? Questions about marriage in our culture now go to the fundamental question of what is right and what is wrong. And not only that, who gets to say what is right and what is wrong? All of authority in our country has been taken down. Number two, not only do they shape our values, but they are unavoidable. They are unavoidable. The second reason that they matter is because they're unavoidable. You may not ask these questions. In fact, you may say, I'm not going to ask these questions. I don't do that. I don't care. But you do answer them by the way you live. You can't choose not to wrestle with morality because almost all of our decisions are moral. Is this morally right or wrong? We live in a culture that tries to suppress these questions. We think that it's a matter of personal and private beliefs, and I don't want to deal with them. That's a fib. I hate to use the word lie. You're fibbing to yourself, though. You may try to push them down. They're like you take a bunch of beach balls. My grandkids are over again. You take a bunch of beach balls and I'm not going to deal with them, you push them down. But they will pop up somewhere and in some way, these questions that we're talking about. They pop up at times when we've been deeply hurt by someone. They pop up in times of crises. When we've had a big failure, or sometimes when we've had a big success, these questions pop up. They are unavoidable. The third reason these questions are really matter is because they are connected. They are connected. The way you decide the answer to one affects the way you decide about the answer to another one. If the Darwinist naturalist is right, and we are just a byproduct of change, of random happenstance, and there's not a mind or a purpose or a God behind the world, then that impacts the question of purpose. What is our purpose as human beings? What is our purpose in walking around on this earth? What is our purpose of taking up space in these pews? Well, you got plenty of space. If there is no purpose to everything, as they say, how could there be a purpose for you, for me? Last week we wrestled with the question of destiny. Back in the 70s, there was this group, English group, known as the Sex Pistols. Are some of you old enough to remember the English group? They had a song that I don't remember this firsthand. It was before my time. But the Sex Pistols sang a song that had the lyrics, "If there is no future, then there is no sin." They felt no guilt for some of the things that they did. They were not only musicians, they were trying to influence and change the culture. and they use guns, they use abuse, whatever. Why not? There is no sin in this world. We can do what we want to do. In other words, if I don't face any judgment after I die, there are no moral demands on my life while I live. Now, you may not realize it yet, but the culture we live in has come to that again. If you want to know why some of the crazy things are going on outside these doors, it's because anything goes. There is no sin. How many times do you hear anybody talking about, well, that was sinful? Even in the church, we don't want to talk about sin. It's one thing to hear it sung about. It's quite another thing to see it lived out in the world around us. The first time that I can remember, or that at least comes out in my mind, where it was lived out was on April the 20th, 1999. Have you heard, do you remember the Columbine shooting? The first school shooting that made international news. Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris, two kids who bought into that dark philosophy called nihilism. Life is meaningless. Life has no purpose. So they said that they had to impose in the writings. That was found after they were shot. If life has no meaning, no purpose, I need to impose my will on this meaningless area around me. And that's when they walked into the cafeteria. It's where they walked into the school and killed those kids. They believed it was when you die, and that's it. You live, you die, and that's all there is. If that's true, then who will punish them after they die? They can do what they want to do. And they did. That is what I mean when I say ideas have consequences. They don't stay in our head. They come out and we live them out. These questions that we're studying are important. They shape our lives. They're unavoidable and they're connected. Oh man, they are more connected than you think. I said a couple weeks ago, when we talk about faith, the faith families, remember I said there are thousands of religious ideas and thousands of faith groups, but they can all be tied into one of three. You have the Judeo-Christian family that we talked about, us. Those faiths would answer the big questions of life pointing to a God who created the world and revealed himself through Scripture. That's a family of faith. Then there's another family of faith, secular families of faith. They would be the atheists, the materialists. I even put the New Age group in there. They would say there is no God who created the world. The world is just a physical place. There's no metaphysical or supernatural aspect to the world. What you see is what you get. You know, what you feel, what you taste, what you smell, what you touch. That's the secularist family. I said to you also the third family there was an Eastern family because they have their roots in Eastern religions. Religions like Hinduism and Buddhism. They are the faiths that say, God is Arlene. God is Nora. God is me. I left out Alan on purpose. No, we're all God, they would say. We are God. It's not that there is a God out there somewhere. The God is in here, inside us. So we have three faith families And they answer these big questions that we're talking about in very different ways. The secularist family and the Eastern family are very different in almost every level and on almost every question. They're very different, except in what we're talking about today, authority. Secularism thinks that the only physical world exists. This Eastern family said, it's not the physical world that's Israel. Yes, there's a physical world, but you try to ignore them, the Eastern families say. You want the spiritual world. The secularist faith thinks that spirituality is an illusion. Because it's not, if you don't see it, you don't taste it, you don't touch it, it's not real. It's Plato all over again, against Socrates. What you see is what you get. They're very different, but on one question they agree fundamentally. Neither of these faith families believe in a God outside the universe. The third family, that's the Western family, it is the religious Judeo-Christian faith family. We say, yeah, there is someone out there. We call him Big G God. If there is no God out there, who is the authority? Who gets to make the decision of what's right and what's wrong? The world we live in, I have been saying, man, the rules have changed. I used to know what was right and what is wrong. The culture we live in says, nah. Who gets to make the decisions in our culture? The individual. It's a very different culture than most of us grew up in. I want us to look at the questions of morality, comparing the three families that we've been talking about. Talk about moral authority. I want us to ask this question. What does the big picture of the Bible say about God's moral authority in our lives? And how does it compare with the other faith families? I think most Americans, most Episcopalians, we like to ride the middle of the road. And it gets tough to do that in the world we're living in. We have a tendency, I think, if you believe in God, which we say we do, we like to choose which parts of those moral authority we'll agree with him on. It's okay to do, well, it's not okay to do this, but I'm going to do this because he's a nice guy. Think about how we live our life out, how we make decisions. You can sum up the story of Scripture in our faith family in 4 chapters. All good stories tell us, remember, where everything came from, what went wrong, and how you fix it. That was in a previous teaching we talked about. Chapter number 1, would you please write down creation? Creation. I'm just going to give you the punchline for the creation chapter. You ready? This world belongs to God. That's it. That's the bottom line. That's the punchline. The creation story of the Bible assumes that this world belongs to God. And God does not come and visit your world. God came to his world. You live in God's world because it says, in the beginning, God created. Yeah. In fact, if you want the theological concept, which the entire Bible is based, it is God is in charge. It's his world. God is so in charge that nothing exists unless he wants it to exist. Remember how the phrase goes? God said, let there be. In the next verses, God says, let there be, and it was. Whether it was animals, whether it was the plants, whatever. In fact, God is in charge, and He's so much in charge, even nothing obeys Him. Ex nihilo, that God created from nothing. He speaks to nothing and says, be something. And nothing says, whoops, okay, I'll be something, even though I'm nothing, because God's in charge. My seminary professor spent weeks on ex nihilo with creating from nothing, so it's got to be important, right? So the world is placed under God's authority. It's His world. Where do you start? Where would you start in this whole understanding of who's in charge, where the authority comes from? The creation chapter tells us that God is the authority over the world, and that includes moral authority, how we behave while we're in His world. What if we came from the other faith groups? What if it says there is no God out there? How would we respond? Then the only place left to look for moral norms, for moral obligation, is not out there, but in here. I have to look inside. Both of the other faith families agree on that. In fact, Paul Kutz, the editor of Humanistic Manifesto 2000, it was done in several other years previously also, but it was the last one that I found was in 2000, said this: humans should not look beyond themselves for salvation. What humanism teach is that we must muster our own courage and compassion to realize our highest inspiration. In other words, we don't look to God. If it's going to be, it's up to me. The Eastern family is very similar in their response to this. I had a conversation one time that illustrates this. I was on a military, I was going up to Wisconsin for some military exercises. And I had an opportunity to be there, and it was a wonderful 14 days. And I flew, let me first say, have you been on an airplane lately? If you haven't been, I want you to know the seats are not what they used to be. They keep making the seating space smaller and smaller, and we Americans kept getting bigger and bigger. There's going to be a collision here pretty soon. But I was fortunate on the way up. I got a exit row. Man, nobody sat in there but dumb people. Why don't you? I got the whole place. But man, I had elbow room, and there was bigger. I like that. Had a wonderful 14 days of military duty. Got back on a plane, and I didn't. It was a full. I didn't get a. I got back in the cattle car. That's when they just shove you back in there and squeeze you in. I think the tail of the plane gets... I looked at the woman I was going to sit beside, and I said, if I'm going to be squeezed, if we are going to be squeezed together, arm to arm, posterior to posterior, for 4 or 5 hours, I forget, I said I might ought to at least say hello. And I said, hello, how are you? Fine, she says. It's going to be a long trip. And I said, oh, yes, it's going to be a long trip. Where are you going? It was a nonstop from Wisconsin to Florida. But I didn't know what else to say. Where are you going? She says, I'm going to Orlando to an Avatar convention. Avatar? I said, what's that? She said, that's where you go and you learn what's the truth? And the truth is, it helps you find your truth. And I said, oh, what do you mean find your truth? And she said, well, we live in a world where everybody's trying to tell you what to believe, especially them religious people. They want to shove their opinion down your throat, and that's not right. And they all want to tell us what we're to believe, but we have the truth inside us. And this convention is going to show me how to find my truth. The first thing that came to my mind is, lady, why in the world are you flying to Orlando to find out what your truth is when you already know it's inside of you? I didn't say that, though. I was... So we got into a really great conversation that just kept on and on past the time anyway, right? Yeah. She kept saying, Chaplain, look inside. Look inside. That's where the truth is. But I said, what if you look inside and you find darkness and violence and anger and... Look deeper. Well, I had 3 or 4 hours. Finally she looked at me and she said, Chaplain, you are God. I'm God, she says. You are God. You have all the truth inside of you because you're God. Now, I don't know if you've ever been called God before, but it's an awkward moment. When I try to play God sometimes around the house, and my wife says, God, would you please take out the trash? But what do you say when someone calls you God, Bruce? What am I supposed to say? Thank you? What am I supposed to... If I was... I did not say this either, but I did think, well, if I'm God, I would be up in first class. Both the secularist and the Eastern family don't have anything outside of themselves to point to answer the moral authority. It is, in moral authority, it's up to you. It's up to me, the individual. It's either we look upward or we look outward. We look upward or outward or inward. I read in the newspaper all the time about someone who's, when they look inward, their highest goal in life is their pleasure. And they use it, and they live to that, and it turns into abuse, whether it's at home or in the people around them, even if it means abusing people. I think that's wrong, period. Do you? To tell people to go look inside for moral authority, I think is like sending someone out into the wilderness with a compass that only points to the self. See, the compass is supposed to point to something that never changes. And you can know where you are by where it is. These two faith families have nothing to orient themselves. The only problem is, by looking inside, sometimes what's inside and what's inside you, inside me, clashes. Even in our own home. Rhoda, what's really important is... She didn't have to say much, just, no. But what do you do when something between us clash? Who is right and who is wrong? Want to take a guess? What happens then? There's a fight. There's a clash. There's someone, Nietzsche said, who's the strongest? Who's the strongest? Might makes right. So that's the creation chapter. The creation chapter is summed up by saying this: there is a God that gives you moral obligation. Well, I think what I'd like to do is stop and pick this up next week. It's important, I think, to go through these. I don't care if you believe what I'm telling you. What I do care is that you have an opinion that is yours. The world that we're living in is telling you what is right, what is wrong. What's your response to them? You can't continue to say, well, let's go see what Father says. No. People in your sphere of influence, you need to communicate, just like I did with that person that I disagreed totally with. It was a wonderful conversation. She was totally wrong, but I didn't tell her that. No, for me, she was totally wrong. And next week we're going to pick up and talk about the other 3 chapters. I hope these things will help you with the questions, for you to work out these answers, and we could work out them together. Okay? My friends, the peace of the Lord be always with you. Greet one another in the name of the Lord.